I woke up last night to the sound of whispering, not just one voice, but two, hushed and close, like they were sitting right beside my bed, arguing in a tone so soft it was more like breathing than speaking. And when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. Only the dim sliver of streetlight filtering in through the cracked blinds, stretching long across the floor like a pale, trembling arm. I lay still for a moment, heart-thudding, listening. But all I could hear was the silence stretching out around me, heavy and listening. It's hard to explain how I ended up here, sleeping in the corner of a one-bedroom apartment I technically don't pay rent for, across from the same childhood friend who once made me believe in something I still can't name. His name is Simon, and when we were kids, he swore there was a guardian spirit living in his room. He called it the Protector. Not a ghost, he insisted, not something bad. It watched over him, kept him safe. And back then, I believed him, or maybe I just believed in him, in that way only children can believe in someone when you share enough sleepless nights and whispered secrets in a flashlight-lit blanket fort. Simon was always a little different, even back then. Sensitive. Oddly intuitive. He could predict when a storm was coming, hours before the sky changed. He'd stare into corners like he was waiting for someone to step out. But he was kind and loyal and funny in a way that made you feel seen. So when he talked about the presence in his room, how it would stand near his bed when he cried, or tap softly on the walls when he was scared, I didn't laugh. I listened. I even started talking to it sometimes, just in case. But then life happened. We grew up, moved away, and lost touch like kids always do. Until last month. I'd just gotten out of a long-term relationship, the kind that leaves you numb and slightly transparent, like something about you got erased while you weren't looking. I didn't have the money to get a new place right away, and I didn't have the mental energy to crash with my parents and relive the whole story 10 times over. So when Simon messaged me out of the blue, saying he had space, it felt like something cosmic, like the universe giving me a soft place to land. Only it didn't feel soft when I got here. The apartment itself is small, but clean, neutral tones, thrift store furniture, plants that look like they've been kept alive through sheer willpower. But Simon's room is different. It's darker than the rest of the apartment, even during the day, like the light stops just short of crossing the threshold. He keeps the blinds closed, the windows locked. There's a single chair in the corner facing his bed, like someone might sit there, watching him sleep, and a dish of water on the floor beside it. I thought it was for a cat at first, but Simon doesn't own a pet. He never explained it to me. Didn't need to. When I walked past his room that first night, I felt it, the same pressure in the air I used to feel when we were kids, standing outside his bedroom door while he whispered, "Don't be scared. It's just watching." Back then, it felt like something magical. Protective. Now, it feels like walking into a room where someone just stopped screaming. Simon still calls it the Protector. He even talks to it when he thinks I'm not listening. His tone isn't playful anymore, it's reverent, quiet, the way you might speak to something that could choose to love you or destroy you, and you're never quite sure which it will be today. At first, I told myself it was just nostalgia. Maybe he never really let go of that childhood fantasy, and who was I to judge? We all have ghosts we carry forward, pieces of the past we press into the cracks of the present to stop ourselves from falling apart. But then things started happening. Not big things, nothing you could point to and say, "There." That's the moment everything turned. Just little things like the living room lamp clicking off on its own, or the bathroom door swinging shut when no windows were open. Cold spots in the hallway. Dreams that bled into morning like bruises, dreams of standing in Simon's room, paralyzed, while something whispered just behind me in a voice I couldn't understand but still somehow knew. Simon says I'm imagining things. That the apartment just feels strange because we're sensitive. He smiles when he says it, but his eyes don't match the shape of his mouth. He's been different lately. Quieter. His sleep is broken, his eyes ringed in shadows, and I've caught him standing in the doorway of his room late at night, whispering under his breath like he's pleading with someone who isn't there. Or maybe someone who is. I don't know why I agreed to stay longer. Maybe I thought I could help him. Maybe part of me missed the version of him who once believed in something so strongly I started to believe it too. But last night changed something. Those voices, those low, hushed voices near my bed, they weren't his. I know what Simon sounds like. And more importantly, I know what he sounds like when he's afraid. Because that's the only other thing I heard just before I finally forced myself to sit up. Simon from his room. Sobbing. Whispering over and over again like a child praying into a pillow. "She told me not to let you stay. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Simon humming softly in the kitchen like nothing had happened, like I hadn't spent the night staring at my bedroom ceiling, unable to sleep. Ears straining for any trace of those whispers or that awful, muffled sobbing. He didn't mention it and I didn't bring it up. We danced around it like a mutual hallucination we weren't ready to admit we'd both seen. Instead, we talked about mundane things, how the heater clicks when it's about to turn on, whether the bus was still late this week, what groceries we were running low on. But I watched him closely as he spoke, and something about him didn't sit right. He was too calm, too composed, like someone who'd spent the morning rehearsing the exact version of himself he wanted me to see. I asked him if he'd slept well, and for just a second, something flickered across his face, something small and sharp like a hairline fracture in glass. Yeah, he said. Better than usual. Then he turned away and started scrubbing an already clean coffee mug, his hand moving in tight, repetitive circles like he didn't know what else to do. That was when I started to notice the patterns. Little rituals. Quiet ones. He would stop just before crossing the threshold into his bedroom, touch the top of the doorframe with 2 fingers, and whisper something under his breath. He always closed the door at exactly midnight, even if he was still inside the room. And once I saw him place a single apple on the windowsill, then sit cross-legged on the floor and stare at it in complete silence for nearly 15 minutes. When I asked him about it, he blinked like I'd startled him awake. It's for her, he said simply. And I didn't ask who he meant. But I think I already knew. There was something wrong with that room. I tried to reason through it at first. Maybe the wiring was old, maybe the insulation was off. But no matter how many logical explanations I told myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that room was always watching. You could feel it in the way the air shifted when the door opened, in the way the shadows gathered just a little too heavily in the corners. Especially in that chair, the old faded armchair in the far corner of the room, facing the bed like it had been placed there for someone else. Not for Simon. For her. I asked him about the chair one night, half joking, trying to cut through the growing unease that had begun to wrap itself around me like a second skin. Is that, like, her throne or something? I laughed, trying to make it sound light. Simon didn't laugh. He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I saw it, the fear. Raw and unfiltered, coiled tight beneath the surface. Don't joke like that, he said. Quiet. Firm. The room felt colder after that. That night I dreamed of the chair. In the dream, I was standing in Simon's room, the door wide open behind me, the window blinds rippling like they were underwater. The air was thick, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. And in the chair, something sat. I couldn't see her clearly, just the shape of her, long and still and heavy like the outline of someone who had never moved, not once, and had no intention of ever leaving. She didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of her attention pressing against my chest like a hand made of smoke. And I knew without question that if I looked directly at her face, I would never wake up again. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs like vines. The chair was empty when I checked the next morning. Of course it was. But the dish of water beside it was gone. When I asked Simon, he just stared at me, then walked into his room, knelt by the corner, and quietly refilled it. Not with tap water, I watched him take a small bottle from his nightstand, the label scratched off, and pour it slowly into the bowl. Why are you still doing this? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. We're not kids anymore. You know that, right? He turned to look at me, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the expression on his face was grief or reverence. She never left, he whispered. Then he looked at the chair. And she doesn't like it when people doubt her. There was no anger in his voice. Only warning. I started locking my bedroom door at night. It wasn't something I had ever done before, not here, not with Simon. But after the dream, after that quiet moment by the chair when he whispered, she doesn't like doubt, I started feeling watched even when I was alone. Not the kind of watched you feel when someone is in the room with you, but the kind that seeps through walls, that stares from behind closed doors and hums low in the dark, just out of range. At first, I thought it was just my nerves. That I was psyching myself out. That living with someone like Simon, someone who gave his fear a name and treated it like a roommate, was slowly rewiring the way I experienced silence. But then things started to change. Subtly at first. Small shifts. Lights flickering when I spoke too harshly. My phone refusing to charge even when the cable was new. A framed photo of me and Simon from our high school graduation that had once sat proudly on the living room shelf, now found face down on the floor, the glass cracked straight through my side of the picture. I asked Simon about it. About all of it. Not accusing, not yet, just trying to see if he'd noticed anything unusual. If he'd say something that would confirm I wasn't slipping into some kind of slow, invisible madness. But he just shook his head and said, "She's adjusting." I asked him what that meant, but he didn't answer. Instead, he left the room. Later that night, I found the chair turned slightly, no longer facing Simon's bed, but angled just so, tilted toward the hallway. Toward my room. I tried to tell myself he did it. Maybe he moved it while cleaning. Maybe he was trying to scare me into playing along. But Simon wasn't that kind of person. Not the boy I grew up with. Not the one who used to cry on my shoulder when his parents fought. Not the one who once built a Lego monument for a beetle we found half dead in the garden because he didn't want it to feel unloved. But maybe that version of him didn't exist anymore. Maybe that version of him had been eaten away by this thing that had rooted itself so deeply in his life he could no longer tell where he ended and it began. One night, maybe 5 or 6 days after the chair moved, I came home from work and found Simon sitting in the dark, the lights off, the windows shut, his hands folded neatly in his lap like a child waiting for punishment. He didn't look at me when I walked in. "She knows," he said. I didn't ask who he meant. I didn't have to. "What does she know?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, like the walls might be listening. "That you don't believe." I opened my mouth to protest, to say something soothing, something logical, something to ground both of us in reality, but then I saw his arms. Long, shallow scrapes ran down the inside of his forearms, red and raw like he'd been clawing at himself in his sleep. They weren't deep, not enough to bleed, but the skin looked irritated, peeled back in uneven lines like something had traced symbols into him with invisible fingers. "Simon," I whispered. "What happened?" "She marks the ones who doubt." I stared at him, trying to decide if this was some kind of psychotic break, if he needed help, real, medical help. But even as I thought it, something cold slid down my spine. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. Because that morning, I'd woken up with a bruise along my thigh, deep and perfectly circular, like a fingertip pressed hard enough to leave a stain. I hadn't mentioned it. I'd written it off. But now I wondered if that was the first warning. Or just the beginning. "I think you need to see someone," I said carefully. "Someone who can help you figure out what's real and what's not." That's when he finally looked up. His eyes were darker than I remembered. Not red, not tired, just sunken, like they'd been staring at something for too long and forgotten how to look away. "She's real," he whispered. "And she listens through the walls." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked to my room. I locked the door. And that night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, barely audible, but it was coming from the wall right behind my headboard. Not from the pipes, not from the ceiling. From inside the wall. A slow, deliberate scrape like nails dragging softly through plaster. Then a voice, so low I almost missed it. "Doubt is dangerous." I started leaving the apartment more often, not for anything important, not even to see anyone in particular, just to get away from the feeling. There was a weight to that place now, a heaviness that settled in the chest and made it harder to breathe the longer you stayed inside. Even in the daylight, even when the sun poured through the windows and the city outside buzzed with life, the apartment felt still. Too still. Like it had learned to hold its breath whenever I walked into the room. Simon hardly noticed. Or if he did, he never let on. He spent most of his time in his room now, door shut, blinds drawn, whispering to something just out of view. I'd hear him at night, murmuring softly, the same phrases over and over like a mantra. "She keeps us safe. We give her peace. She doesn't like when they forget." I stopped asking what he meant. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet, not exactly. It was something deeper, more primitive, the instinct to not disturb whatever was watching us from the other side of the wall. I hadn't dreamed since that night with the chair. At least not in a way I could remember. But my sleep had become something else entirely, a half-conscious drift through muffled sounds and pressure changes, the sensation of being pulled just slightly out of alignment, like my body stayed in bed while something else wandered. Sometimes I'd wake up with the sense that I had just been somewhere else. Somewhere without light. Somewhere with eyes. And always, I'd wake up to find my bedroom door unlocked. Even though I checked it. Even though I remembered turning the key, hearing the click. It didn't matter. The lock didn't matter anymore. One night, maybe 2 weeks after the scratching started, I came home from the library to find the entire apartment bathed in candlelight. Dozens of tiny flames flickered across every surface, the kitchen counters, the bookshelves, the floor along the hallway like a path leading inward. At first I thought we'd lost power, but when I flipped the light switch, the overhead lights came on just fine. Simon stood in the middle of the living room. He was barefoot, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his shirt damp with sweat like he'd just finished running a fever. The look on his face was blank. Not vacant, not like someone who wasn't there, but as if he was there and fully aware, only he'd stopped pretending to be someone I'd recognize. I asked him what was going on. He didn't respond. I stepped toward him, my foot nudging one of the small bowls of water scattered across the carpet. There were 9 of them, maybe more, all identical to the one he kept next to the chair. All filled to the very top. Not a drop spilled, not a ripple on the surface. She wanted to be acknowledged, he said suddenly. His voice didn't sound like it belonged to him. It was Simon's tone, yes, same cadence, same inflection, but underneath it, something echoed. Something just slightly out of sync, like a second voice layered faintly over the first. She doesn't like being ignored. Simon, I said, my throat dry. You're scaring me. He turned slowly to look at me. And for the first time since we were kids, I didn't recognize his eyes. They weren't angry. They weren't sad. They were devoted. Don't be scared, he said. She doesn't want to hurt you. The implication sat heavy in the air. She doesn't want to, but she can. I didn't sleep that night. I waited until Simon had gone back to his room, until the candles had burned out on their own, leaving puddles of wax and a scorched smell that clung to my clothes. I sat by my door, back pressed against it, kitchen knife in my lap, listening for footsteps that never came. But something came. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard the sound of the chair in Simon's room dragging across the floor. Not rocking. Not creaking. Sliding. As if someone had stood from it. Or worse, as if someone had just sat down. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just closed my eyes and prayed, not to God, not to anything I'd ever believed in before. I prayed to the chair, to the corner, to the thing that lived in the hollow between us. And just before I fell into the shallow, stifling grip of sleep, I thought I heard her voice. Right outside my door. Whispering a question I'll never forget. Do you want him to leave or me? Something changed after that night. It wasn't dramatic, nothing cinematic or sudden, but it was felt like a barely noticeable shift in air pressure before a storm. The apartment had always felt off, but now it pulsed with something more deliberate, more aware. Like it knew I had heard her. Or maybe answered her. Because after that question, that soft, coiled whisper just outside my bedroom door, something began following me beyond our apartment walls. I noticed it first in the reflections. The rearview mirror in my rideshare one morning flickered just for a second, like something had moved in the back seat. But when I turned around, the car was empty and the driver didn't seem to notice anything. At work, the cafe's freezer door would creak open on its own, not once, not twice, but every night I closed alone, and inside, my breath would fog more than it should, like I wasn't the only one breathing in there. But the worst part was the mirror in the apartment bathroom. For days, maybe longer, I'd catch something standing just behind me in the reflection. It didn't move. It didn't shift or wave or blink. It waited. Tall. Still. No features. Just a darker shape in the already dark room. It vanished every time I turned around. Every time. Simon, meanwhile, had become more devout than ever, if that's the word for it. He stopped going to class. Stopped shaving. Stopped referring to her as anything but a proper noun. She. Like a god or something worse. He began rearranging the apartment in strange, meticulous ways, salt poured along the baseboards, threadless needles stuck into door frames, and tiny symbols drawn in pencil near every corner. He wouldn't explain them, but he told me I shouldn't erase them. They keep the wrong things out, he said. Or keep the right things in. When I asked him what that meant, he just smiled and said something I didn't understand at the time. She needs boundaries. So do we. Then, one night, everything broke open. It started with the sound of humming. Not music, not anything with melody, just a deep, continuous vibration, almost mechanical, like the walls were straining under something invisible. I stepped into the hallway and felt it under my feet, a low, throbbing hum coming from Simon's room, rhythmic and constant. When I pushed his door open, the light inside was flickering like it was underwater. Simon was sitting in the middle of the floor. The chair was empty. For the first time since we moved in, it wasn't facing the bed or the hallway. It was facing him. And Simon wasn't speaking. He wasn't praying or whispering or mumbling to himself like he usually did. He was listening. His eyes were shut, lips slightly parted, a faint smile on his face, like whatever he was hearing was beautiful. Holy! I took a step into the room. He didn't move. But the light dimmed just slightly and something in the air shifted. Like the room had drawn a breath. Like I had just stepped into something alive. I whispered his name. Still nothing. So I walked closer until I stood behind him, looking over his shoulder at the floor in front of the chair. And that's when I saw it. The notebook. Open. Pages filled not in Simon's handwriting, which was clean, rounded, familiar, but in something jagged and unfamiliar, like it had been carved rather than written. The language wasn't English. I don't think it was a language at all, but I recognized the symbol drawn at the top of each page. It was the same one etched faintly into the wall behind the chair, the one I'd never noticed until that moment. A circle, split cleanly down the center. A gate. And then I turned the page. And there it was. My name. Written again and again in that same clawed script. Dozens of times. Some of them crossed out. Some circled. One smeared with what looked like dried blood. And underneath them, a phrase in Simon's real handwriting. She said I could trade if I wanted to. My blood turned cold. I backed away from him, stumbling slightly as the room seemed to pulse around me, not visually, not physically, but in feeling like my very presence was being rejected. Simon opened his eyes slowly and looked up at me, and I swear to God, for just a split second, they weren't his eyes. They were hollow. Empty. Like something else had stepped forward in his skin just long enough to say, "She prefers you now." I left the apartment that night without saying a word. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just picked up my coat from the hallway, quietly slipped on my shoes, and stepped out the front door like someone leaving a dinner party they didn't realize was a seance. I walked 3 blocks before I even let myself breathe fully, and another 5 before I realized I'd forgotten my phone on the kitchen table. I didn't go back. Not then. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, one of those roadside places that looks abandoned until you step inside and realize it just exists on the fringe of attention. I paid cash, locked the door, and slept in short, shallow stretches with the light on. And still, I dreamed of the chair. Empty now. Waiting. It wasn't until the second night in that room, hunched over a cheap cup of motel coffee, staring at the shadow beneath the bathroom door like it might move, that I remembered something. A story Simon told me when we were 12. We'd been camping in his backyard, nestled in sleeping bags beneath a too-thin nylon tent, trading ghost stories to pass the time. I remember laughing at him, not in a mean way, but the way kids laugh when they want to seem brave, because his story wasn't scary. Not really. It was about a girl who lived in a house that hated her. Not haunted. Hated. Every night, the house would creak louder. The walls would close in. The air would turn colder. Until finally, the girl went into the attic, lit a candle, and whispered something into the dark. And the house whispered back, "Give me someone else." I never thought about that story again until I saw my name written in Simon's notebook. And suddenly, I started wondering if that night all those years ago was just a story. Or a confession. The next morning, I went back. Not because I wanted to. Not because I thought I could fix anything. But because I needed answers, not about her, not about the symbols or the scratching or the whispers in the walls, but about Simon. Because I was starting to wonder if the boy I loved like a brother ever really left that room. When I opened the door, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The apartment was too quiet. Not still. Not peacefully silent. But the kind of quiet that hums beneath the skin. That presses in around your ears like your body's trying to warn you before your mind can catch up. Simon was in the kitchen, standing perfectly still, staring out the window, his hands limp at his sides. There were bruises on his arms now, deep, spiraling ones that almost looked like fingerprints. He didn't look at me, didn't move, just kept whispering something I couldn't hear until I stepped closer. "She's not talking to me anymore." He said it like a child confessing something unforgivable. "I did everything she asked," he continued, voice cracking. "I gave her everything. The water, the silence, the promises." He turned to me slowly. "And then you came." I took a step back without meaning to. His face was wrong. Not physically, but something in his expression didn't belong to him. Like the weight of what he'd done had collapsed inward, folding all the familiar pieces of him into something brittle and unfamiliar. "I think," he said, voice barely audible. "I think she wants you now. I think she's choosing." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he kept talking, words spilling like a confession to a priest who'd already started closing the doors behind him. "She only ever protected me when I was afraid. That's how she comes. That's how she feeds." And then the second twist finally slid into place. Simon hadn't been chosen. He'd been cultivated. She hadn't protected him. She'd fostered his fear, nurtured it, fed on it. All those years, the stories, the prayers, the chair in the corner. It was never love. It was ownership. And now that Simon had grown too broken, too dependent, too numb, she wanted something fresher, something still learning to fear her. "Me," she told me, Simon whispered. "If I brought someone who remembered her name, I could leave." And I understood. The moment I moved in, I became the trade. Not some accident. Not some slow corruption of the past. A planned exchange. Simon finally looked at me then. Really looked. There was no relief in his eyes. Only guilt. And under that, something worse. Hope. I don't remember unlocking the door that night. I only remember standing in the hallway again, staring into Simon's darkened room, and realizing the chair had moved once more. It wasn't in the corner. It wasn't facing the bed. It wasn't turned toward the hallway. It was right in the center of the room, facing me. I don't know why I stepped inside. I think part of me needed to see it up close. Not the chair, but the thing behind it, inside it, the thing using it. I wanted to see her, to know, to stop wondering if all of this, the whispers, the bruises, the rituals, was a slow descent into madness or something worse. Because there's a kind of safety in madness, isn't there? If you're crazy, then it's just your mind. A glitch, a sickness. You can be treated. But if it's real, there's no door out. There's only the chair. I stepped into the room, and the air immediately shifted. It was warmer than I expected. Not hot, but dense, like the inside of a crowded elevator. My lungs felt slower. My vision tightened. The air smelled like water left too long in a sealed jar. And underneath that, something else. Rotting flowers. I stood in front of the chair. It was old now, far older than I remembered. The fabric had thinned, the wood warped in places, and for the first time, I noticed something etched faintly into the backrest. The same circle, split clean down the middle. The gate. I reached out, just to touch it, not to challenge her, not to mock her, to understand. But just before my fingers made contact, a soft voice filled the room. Not from behind me, from inside me. "Sit." I didn't want to. I swear to God, I didn't want to. But my knees buckled. My body moved on instinct. I sank into the chair like a puppet guided by invisible strings. And the second my skin touched the fabric, I understood why Simon never really left this room. Because something seeps into you, something not yours. It doesn't speak in words. It doesn't scream or laugh or chant in some ancient tongue. It whispers in memories, in doubt. It shows you your fears and wraps itself around them, makes them feel sacred, like scars you'd never dare remove. And then it tells you a secret so quiet you start to believe it came from you. The secret is this: you are safer if you stay. The longer you sit, the truer it becomes. That was 3 nights ago. Simon's gone. I don't mean he left. I mean he's gone. His things are still here, his books, his jacket, his toothbrush, but I haven't seen him since that night in the kitchen when he told me about the trade. The notebook disappeared too. I've searched every drawer, every corner of the apartment. Nothing. No pages. No explanation. Just an empty silence that stretches across the space like a held breath. But she's still here. The water dish fills itself now. The chair never collects dust. And at night I hear her pacing. Not in the hallway. Not in Simon's room. In mine. Sometimes she whispers again. Sometimes she hums. Sometimes she just watches from the other side of the mirror, waiting for me to fall asleep so she can get closer, so she can step through whatever thin film of reality still separates us and press her hollow face against mine and whisper, "You're mine now." I tell myself I'll leave. That I'll pack my bag, throw everything into a suitcase and run. But every time I reach for the doorknob I freeze. Because she might follow. Or worse, she already has. Some nights, I stare at my own reflection and something stares back just a beat too late. Not off by much. Just enough to be wrong. Just enough to make me wonder if the part of me that left the chair is still me at all. I haven't slept in 2 days. And still, every morning, I find myself waking up in that chair. No memory of how I got there. No memory of falling asleep. Just the imprint of her fingers on my arms. She doesn't need Simon anymore. She has someone new. And the truth is, I think I finally understand what he meant when he said, she keeps us safe. Because sometimes safety isn't freedom. Sometimes safety is just a cage you learn to love.